Well, I think we're ready to get started. Thank you so much for your patience. It's now 6 minutes after 8 Eastern Standard Time. And just wanted to say good morning or good afternoon, excellencies, distinguished speakers and participants in Monrovia, Brussels, Atlanta, Boston, and other places throughout the world. We are so delighted to have you participate in this important 2 day workshop on human trafficking, trapped in transit, for those working in the transportation, travel, and tourism industries. The goal of the workshops will be to make it possible for workers at all levels to recognize the signs of human trafficking, how to respond and report, as well as understand how everyone can help end human trafficking in Liberia. My name is Cynthia Blandford, and I have the distinct honor of serving as the honorary consul for the Republic of Liberia in Atlanta, Georgia, since 2009, and the president and board chair of the University Consortium for Liberia in Atlanta, Georgia. You are most welcome. Today, I have the pleasure of co-hosting the 2 day virtual human trafficking workshop with my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Layli Mapayan, who I've known for over 10 years. She serves as the executive director for Wellesley Centers for Women, and she's an outstanding leader. Thank you, Lady and Wellesley Center for Women, for your leadership and support in working with the University Consortium for Liberia Board of Directors, of which you are also a member and a founding partner, to apply successfully for this grant. You are appreciated at the highest level for your outstanding work. I also want to take this opportunity to thank our incredible and distinguished speakers, who I will introduce according to the planned agenda, which you should all have with you by now. You are in for a treat as they share their expertise and provide solutions and recommendations in the fight against human trafficking in Liberia. I'm also pleased to welcome our partners, our US partners. As I mentioned, we have members from the University Consortium for Liberia board members joining us today, Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, our local implementing partners in Liberia, the University of Liberia, the Liberian Airport Authority, LAA, and our international partner, Brussels Airlines, both at the corporate level and the country level in Monrovia. You are most welcome. We've also had the pleasure to engage Liberians in the diaspora, tourism experts in Monrovia, and with the intervention and engagement of the Carter Center, located here in Atlanta, Georgia, but they also have an office in Monrovia. Thanks to their leadership, we also have members of the National Council of Chiefs and Elders, the Motorcycle Transport Union, Wangosal, FL, the Liberian National Bar Association, NAMOTE, Federation of Liberian Youth, and the Press Union of Liberia participating today. You are also most welcome. Last but certainly not least, these workshops would not be possible without the funding support of the United States Department of State, U.S. Embassy Monrovia, Public Affairs Section Annual Program Grant. We appreciate your confidence in our team to help bring awareness and solutions to human trafficking in Liberia. A special thanks and appreciation to my new dear friend, His Excellency Michael McCarthy, U.S. Ambassador to Liberia in Monrovia, for his ongoing leadership and support. So let's get started. Human trafficking is a human rights concern that is also closely tied to issues of sexual and gender-based violence, GBV, two priority themes of Public Affairs Section in Monrovia between 2020 and 2021. Liberia's ranking in the US State Department's Trafficking in Persons report declined, unfortunately, from level 2 to level 2 watch list. For some time, Liberia's human trafficking statistics have been an impediment at the United Nations level and with other gatekeeping organizations, and they have also put a damper on business development and private sector investment in Liberia. Mindful that the government of Liberia has taken recent strides to address trafficking by forming an interagency commission, we believe that concerted efforts by an ever-enlarging set of diverse stakeholders, both local, national, and international, to address trafficking will help curb the tide of this form of violence, most commonly affecting women and children, especially the most economically vulnerable. Our plan is to work together, pooling our considerable and distinct resources from university, community, and private sector partners to help reduce sexual and gender-based violence in Liberia. Welcome and many thanks again for your participation. And at this time, I would like to turn the program over to my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Layli Mapiling, to bring a welcome and opening remarks. Layli?
Thank you so much, Cynthia. Good morning and good afternoon to everyone. As Cynthia said, I'm Layli Mapiling, Executive Director of the Wellesley Centers for Women and also a Professor of Africana Studies at Wellesley College in the greater Boston area of the United States. It's my pleasure and privilege to also welcome you to today's workshop. When the U.S. Embassy Monrovia issued an opportunity to support projects that address gender-based violence in Liberia, the University Consortium for Liberia, which my institute, the Wellesley Centers for Women, is a member, as Cynthia mentioned, we knew we had to jump on it. For over a decade, gender issues in Liberia have been a key area of focus for both the University Consortium for Liberia and the Wellesley Centers for Women. Since the beginning of Cynthia's and my collaboration at the International Women's Colloquium in Liberia in 2009. Our joint mission has been to offer able partnership to those in Liberia working on women's and gender issues in any area of endeavor. When we discovered that trafficking had emerged as a renewed concern based on the July 2021 Trafficking in Persons report published by the U.S. Department of State, we knew we'd found our issue for the next phase of our work. I'd like to add my thanks to the U.S. Embassy Monrovia for getting behind this work with their support. The purpose of today's workshop is to convene many people who have the ability to do something about trafficking. It was the most logical thing in the world to start with the transportation, travel, and tourism sector because trafficking is about movement, the movement of people from one location to another for the purposes of exploitation. As we know, much trafficking utilizes transportation, relies upon travel, and hides under the cover of tourism to achieve its purposes. Thus, it is a site at which to intervene and stop trafficking in its tracks. Yet, trafficking also has cultural and site-specific dimensions. We need to take these into account so that we don't risk failure through one-size-fits-all approaches. Rather, we need culturally nuanced and culturally respectful approaches rooted in cross-cultural dialogue and collaboration. What we hope is that everyone will learn something today, as we have many kinds of experts and many kinds of attendees. What connects us is our common relationship to the movement of people and the ways in which we work together to make that a positive rather than a negative experience. Together, we can learn to recognize trafficking, take action to stop it, and ultimately eradicate trafficking. That's why we're here today and tomorrow. Now, just a reminder that this workshop is being recorded on both days in order to create an educational resource that can be used over time by many people. And we'll share the link with all participants when it's ready. We really want the opportunity to capture the important speakers and valuable information that will be shared on both days. I now want to take a few moments to go over today's program so that those of you who are participating have a sense of what to expect. This roughly 4-hour workshop will have the same format on both days. We're going to begin with an opening session, opening remarks by high-level speakers who are going to introduce us to the topic and give us a landscape view of the problem. We'll then move into sessions by transportation partners and research experts who are going to drill down on important information about trafficking, how to recognize it, how to stop it, and how to think about it as we all work together to end trafficking. Following that, we will have a session in which we present other high-level speakers to round us out and give us a closing charge each day. So expect something similar today and tomorrow with different speakers to flesh out the program. And as Cynthia mentioned, we'll introduce each speaker in turn in the program. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Cynthia to introduce today's first speaker. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Layli, for that high-level overview. And again, thank you very much for your ongoing leadership and support and that of Wellesley Center for Women. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, at this time, I would like to introduce a colleague and partner of mine, and also in particular, a partner in our sister airport agreement between Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport and the Liberian Airport Authority, Mr. Michael Smith. I was delighted to host the Atlanta Airport leadership in Liberia last year, Alreen Richards-Barr, Elliot Page in particular, to join me in Liberia for our sister airport technical team meeting. We conducted training and also discussed human trafficking as it was discussed as a priority area of need. Mr. Michael Smith, as a leader participating in North America's busiest and most efficient airport, Michael L. Smith is the Airport Senior Deputy General Manager. He manages the department's day-to-day functions, including commercial operations, marketing, communications, public affairs, business diversity, law, human resources, procurement, etc. Mr. Smith has nearly 2 decades of municipal government experience, having served 17 years with the City of Atlanta as a senior assistant city attorney. During that time, he practiced all aspects of local government law, including litigation, contracts, etc. He also served as Atlanta's lead counsel representing the Department of Aviation and was responsible for negotiating agreements related to airlines and other airport tenants. Before joining Hartsfield-Jackson, Mr. Smith was a private practice attorney specializing in local government law, airport, and aviation matters. Mr. Smith began his legal career as a law clerk working for the Honorable Clarence Cooper here in Atlanta, Georgia. He is an Atlanta native. He has a degree in political science from Duke University and a law degree from North Carolina Central University. Please help me welcome Mr. Michael Smith. Michael?
Good morning, and thank you, Cynthia, and good afternoon to some. Thank you for allowing me to join you for the opening session of one of the most essential workshops we've taken part in this year. Every life on this planet is precious. Human trafficking devalues that life. That's why this Combating Human Trafficking in Transportation, Travel and Tourism in Liberia workshop matters, as we all put forth our best effort to put an end to this practice. Human trafficking may be too kind of a term for this $150 billion industry. It has been called modern day slavery, and it continues to devastate lives around the world. At Hartsfield-Jackson, the world's busiest airport, we remain committed to stopping those who traffic men, women, and children in our backyard. Our commitment began back in November 2016, when we held our first stakeholder forum. We are no less invested now as we continue our efforts to prevent human trafficking, not just in Atlanta, but around the globe. In 2017, Atlanta became the first airport in the world to sign a pledge to the Tourism Child Protection Code of Conduct, an action plan to end the sexual exploitation of children. Because we touch so many travelers globally and have the influence to do so, we leverage that to protect the lives of potential victims through our staff's continual awareness training and our messaging to hundreds of thousands of passengers who pass through Atlanta every day. By now, if you've been in our facility, you've heard our public service announcement urging everyone to stop the practice of human trafficking. And if you see something, say something. Airports nationally reach out to Hartsfield-Jackson, our team, for copies of our program so that they can activate a human trafficking awareness program at their respective facilities. So our airport is not only making a difference in Georgia, but across the nation. The efforts of our Atlanta team and our partners are effective. To date, there have been no known cases of human trafficking at our airport, and we plan to keep it that way. So events like this are vitally important as they keep us aware of the signs of human trafficking and its dangers. We look forward to hearing our distinguished guests on this program and to speak about their role in this fight. In closing, I say we're honored to be part of this workshop and hope that the information that will be shared and discussed over the next 2 days will move us forward in our fight against human trafficking. So I thank you for allowing us to join us today. Thank you, Cynthia.
Thank you very much, Michael. I'm so excited to have you join us today and excited for the leadership that Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport continues to provide in this human trafficking space. So thank you to you and your team for your outstanding efforts. At
You're
this
welcome.
time, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce to you Honorable Joel Mayberry. He currently serves as the Deputy Chief of Mission at the U.S. Embassy in Monrovia, Liberia. He has been assigned to many important roles throughout the world. And in one of his previous assignments, he was a senior advisor and director of operation in the Secretary's Office of Global Women's Issues at the U.S. Department of State. Honorable Mayberry was formerly deputy director in the Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons, where he oversaw the Office International Programs Team and Resource Management and Planning Team. He had a distinguished career, as I mentioned, throughout the globe. Honorable Mayberry attended the National Defense University's Eisenhower School, where he received an MS in International Resource Strategy. He has received numerous department awards, including the Secretary's Award for Public Outreach for his public diplomacy and political engagement with different Muslim communities, and Superior Honor and Meritorious Honor Awards. He holds a BA in International Relations and French Literature from the University of California. Please help me to welcome Honorable Mayberry. Honorable.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Cynthia, and happy Thanksgiving from Liberia to everybody on this call. Liberians today are celebrating Thanksgiving, and it's really wonderful to be in that atmosphere. So I wanted to begin by acknowledging the organizers and by greeting all of you for this two-day workshop. The United States government is really proud to be a supporter of this event, and we cannot overemphasize how important the issue of human trafficking is and how critical it is for all of us, governments, civil society, the private sector, to make concerted long-term efforts, short-term efforts to combat this scourge. I come to you today not only as the Deputy Chief of Mission of the U.S. Embassy in Monrovia, and I do send greetings from Ambassador McCarthy, by the way, but also as a career Foreign Service officer who has worked directly, as Cynthia noted, in the State Department's Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons, known as the TIP office. This has been one of the most important issues in my career, and I'm glad to be part of our wider efforts in Liberia. During my time in the TIP office, I learned about the ways that airlines, airports, and others in the travel industry contribute to the fight against modern-day slavery. As a diplomat, I spent a lot of time in the air, and in conversations with flight attendants, I've often been impressed by their knowledge and passion on this issue, as well as their ability to identify suspicious patterns that might indicate trafficking. In addition to their many other duties and challenges, it is clear to me that they take their role as possible TIP first responders very seriously. We should applaud them. The government of Liberia, like most governments around the world, has acknowledged the existence of human trafficking both on its territory and beyond its national borders. Liberia's international commitments, including its 2004 accession to the Palermo Protocol, and especially its recently amended anti-trafficking law, leave no doubt about this. Let me quote the preamble of Liberia's newly amended law to ban trafficking in persons within the Republic. Whereas human trafficking anywhere in the world must be considered modern-day slavery and a threat to all nations, it also constitutes multiple grave human rights abuses that promotes the breakdown of families and communities, fuels organized crime, deprives countries of human capital and revenues and resources, undermines public health, creates opportunities for extortion and subversion among government officials, and imposes large economic costs on nations. The preamble continues. Human trafficking in both the public and private sectors of the Liberian society contribute to undermine the institutional framework for good governance, and as a consequence, has hampered sustainable socio-political tranquility and retarded economic development and growth. My friends, that is Liberia's voice, Liberia's commitment. As with many challenges that our governments face, it is imperative that we demonstrate our commitment with actions, with sustained government efforts. It is not just good enough to adopt the law must also be fully implemented. Let me talk about human trafficking in Liberia, and I will use the US Department of State's 2021 Trafficking in Persons report issued last July as my reference. The TIP report is the US government's principal diplomatic and diagnostic tool to guide relations with foreign governments on human trafficking. It is also the world's most comprehensive resource of government anti-trafficking efforts and reflects the US government's commitment to global leadership on this key human rights, law enforcement, and national security issue. This 2021 TIP report includes narratives for 188 countries and territories, including the United States. As noted in the country report for Liberia, as reported over the past 5 years, human traffickers exploit domestic and foreign victims in Liberia, and traffickers exploit victims from Liberia abroad. Trafficking within the country is more prevalent than transnational trafficking, and the majority of victims are children. Traffickers recruit and exploit most victims within the country's borders in domestic servitude, forced begging, sex trafficking, or forced labor in street vending, gold and alluvial diamond mines, and on small-scale rubber plantations. Traffickers typically operate independently and are commonly family members who promise poor relatives a better life for their children or promise young women a better life for themselves, take the children or women to urban areas, and subsequently exploit them in forced labor in street vending, domestic service, or sex trafficking. Traffickers are also often well-respected community members who exploit the quote-unquote foster care system common across West Africa. Traffickers exploit orphan children in street vending and child sex trafficking. Liberian nationals, and to a lesser extent foreigners, exploit children in sex trafficking in Monrovia. Traffickers exploited a small number of Liberian men, women, and children in other West African countries, including Cote d'Ivoire, Guinea, Mauritania, Nigeria, Senegal, and Sierra Leone. Again, I just quoted you from our report issued last July. The report determined that the government of Liberia did not fully meet the minimum standards for the elimination of human trafficking, the requirement for a country to be ranked as Tier 1. But it is making efforts to do so. These efforts included opening a new shelter for child trafficking victims, initiating an investigation into a high-profile labor trafficking case in cooperation with foreign governments, and allocating funding to NGOs to conduct awareness-raising campaigns. However, the government did not demonstrate overall increasing efforts compared to the previous reporting period, even considering the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on its anti-trafficking capacity. The government identified fewer victims, initiated fewer investigations, prosecuted fewer defendants, and did not sentence any traffickers. Law enforcement officials still lack adequate resources and understanding of human trafficking to effectively investigate and prosecute trafficking crimes. Shelter services for victims remained insufficient, and the government did not provide support for non-governmental organizations caring for victims. For these reasons, Liberia was downgraded to the Tier 2 watch list. If possible, you will look at a map now of the Africa region on your screen, and you will see the different tier rankings of countries in Africa. And just as a guide, green is Tier 1, yellow is Tier 2, Orange is tier 2 watch list, and you can see Liberia in that category. I guess that's a burgundy or brown is tier 3, and then blue in the case of Somalia is a special case. Let's leave that slide up just for another minute or so people can appreciate what's going on across the Africa region, which you will note does not include the Maghreb. As we do every year when the Trafficking in Persons report is released to the public, diplomats at the U.S. Embassy in Monrovia meet with government officials, the media, and civil society organizations to review our assessment, including the tier ranking, and to discuss the all-important prioritized recommendations. Just so everyone is clear in this workshop, because I believe it bears repeating, the annual report compares a government's efforts from year to year with the, quote, minimum standards for the elimination of trafficking, quote, in the areas of prosecution, protection, and prevention as the basis of our assessment. The TIP report determines tier rankings on the U.S. Trafficking Victims Protection Act, otherwise known as TVPA, minimum standards, which closely track with the United Nations Palermo protocols. Let's now take a look at the slide that explains the difference between the tiers. Again, tier 1, 2, tier 2 watch list, and tier 3. While we're waiting for that slide to come up. Tier 1 is for those countries whose governments fully meet the TVPA's minimum standard for the elimination of trafficking. You can see that on the screen. Tier 2 is for those countries whose governments do not fully meet the TVPA's minimum standards, but are making significant efforts to bring themselves into compliance with those standards. That's where Liberia was last year. Tier 2 watch list is for those countries whose governments do not fully meet the TVPA's minimum standards, but are making significant efforts to bring themselves into compliance with those standards. Tier 3 is for those countries whose governments do not fully meet the minimum standard for the elimination of trafficking and are not making significant efforts to do so. And they may then face restrictions in the form of sanctions on non-humanitarian assistance, subject to the President of the United States' approval. It is important to note that countries ranked tier 2 watch list for 2 consecutive years may face an automatic downgrade to tier 3 if they do not make significant efforts to meet the minimum standards for the elimination of trafficking. Again, our approach after we have issued the annual report is to meet with appropriate government officials and go over the prioritized recommendations specific to their country. These prioritized recommendations are crafted on the basis of our understanding of where a given government can make genuine efforts to improve how it prevents human trafficking, how it protects individuals from falling prey to human traffickers, and how the government prosecutes those actors who commit the crime. I should note that this discussion about recommended actions does not have to begin at the time the annual report is published. In fact, the best practice is a year-round engagement, and our Liberian partners know this. That year-round engagement involves regular check-ins with law enforcement authorities, political leaders, civil society, and the private sector that culminates with our embassies collecting data and anecdotes from as many sources as possible so that we can analyze the situation and prepare our annual report. If you're wondering, the reporting period each year begins on April 1st and ends on March 31st. In other words, we give a government every opportunity to demonstrate that it is taking actions, that it's making significant efforts to prevent, protect, and prosecute. It's nice to remember that 3 Ps paradigm. And again, in the case of Liberia, just as in every other country around the world, March 31st, 2022 will mark the end of the current reporting period. And it's before then, and certainly no later than that date, that we would hope to have all the data, all the anecdotes available so that we can begin our narrative and our analysis to prepare the next report that will be due in late June, early July of 2022. As I like to say in my meetings with Liberian government officials, if they are taking the TIP report to heart, and I know they are, and that they're devoting the necessary resources to the effort, then they have a good news story to tell. And the United States Annual Report is a highly respected vehicle for helping tell that good news. So let's now take a look at the prioritized recommendations for Liberia. Next slide, please. I'll begin talking about many of these, and you'll see the effect of the slide will give you an idea that we mean business. And we sit down with our Liberian interlocutors, and this is what we discuss. I don't expect you to read all that real quickly, but it gives you an idea of the seriousness with which we tackle these issues. And across the world, we come up with prioritized recommendations for every country. We see increased efforts to investigate and prosecute trafficking cases, including internal trafficking cases and officials accused of complicity. Training law enforcement and judicial officials on identifying, investigating, and prosecuting cases under the 2005 anti-trafficking law, now an amended law. Listen to this one. Amend the 2005 anti-trafficking law to remove the requirement of force, fraud, or coercion in child sex trafficking cases. And this one. Amend the 2005 anti-trafficking law to prescribe penalties for adult trafficking that are sufficiently stringent and commensurate with the penalties for other grave crimes. Expand victim services, particularly for victims outside the capital, males, and victims requiring long-term care. Increase financial or in-kind support to NGOs that support trafficking victims. Train law enforcement, labor inspectors, immigration officials, and social workers on standard victim identification procedures and the national referral mechanism. Allocate financial and in-kind resources as feasible to the anti-trafficking task force. Increase labor inspections in the informal sector and mining regions to improve identification of trafficking cases, including child forced labor. Increase efforts to raise public awareness of human trafficking, including internal trafficking, and so on. We are 7 months into the reporting period that will be considered as part of the 2022 Trafficking in Persons report, as I noted earlier. First of all, let me say this, and be very clear about it. The United States applauds the government of Liberia for amending the 2005 anti-trafficking law. Its anti-trafficking law. This was accomplished on October 1st. That is a major accomplishment that involved the different branches of Liberia's government and the United States diplomatic engagement. Thank you, Liberia. Also, the Ministry of Labor has contracted 10 non-governmental organizations and civil society organizations to conduct a 15-county 3-month awareness raising program, or campaign rather, on the new TIP law until December 31st. Again, thank you, Ministry of Labor. In addition, the Ministry of Finance has allocated $100,000 towards anti-TIP and child labor efforts. Thank you, Ministry of Finance. We also commend civil society organizations for their active involvement in reporting potential trafficking cases and coordinating services for potential victims. Let me just name a few: the Liberia Association of Female Sociologists, Community Watch Forum, the Defense for Children International, the National Concerned Youth of Liberia, Orphan Relief and Rescue, World Hope International, and YWCA Liberia. Although progress in combating human trafficking must be led by the government of Liberia in partnership with civil society, the U.S. Embassy remains committed to providing appropriate support. For example, with funding from the Department of State Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs, the International Development Law Organization has developed TIP curricula for the Liberian law enforcement and judicial sectors, including a bench book for judges, a handbook for prosecutors, and training for law enforcement officers. These are terrific resources. The government of Liberia has joined IDLO, the International Development Law Organization, in trainings for more than 200 prosecutors, judges, and other judicial actors. USAID has also worked with the Ministry of Labor and the TIP Secretariat here in Liberia to raise awareness of TIP and how to report suspected trafficking. For example, through a program implemented by Catholic Relief Services, rural residents of Nimba and Montserrado counties met with local leaders and government of Liberia officials to raise awareness of what human trafficking is, how it impacts communities, and what community members and local authorities can do to prevent trafficking. Finally, I want to emphasize a point that my colleagues and I have made in our meetings with Liberian government officials. And I know those government officials are smiling right now because they know exactly what I'm about to say. This fight that you're in, the fight to ban modern slavery, is a worthy one, but it requires the stamina of a marathon runner. While it is laudable to have sprinters make certain efforts in a given year, please, please do not rest on your laurels. All of us who are engaged in this endeavor must demonstrate political will and commit the necessary resource to keep combating the scourge year after year. Thank you all, and may the rest of this workshop lead to greater public awareness, greater government action, and greater collaboration with the private sector. Thank you so much.
Thank you so very much, Joel. We really appreciate your outstanding performance today, giving us information, tips and tools, the challenges that we are faced with in terms of the human trafficking issues facing the Republic of Liberia. We are so honored to have you as one of our strategic partners and stakeholders in this space. And we look forward to working with you in the months and years ahead. So thank you very much, and please our best regards to Ambassador McCarthy. Thank you. At this time, I believe Dr. Mapayan, I think we're going right into our 9 o'clock session. Is that correct? Yes. Transportation.
We have a few minutes before our 9 o'clock session begins, and I was really hoping that both Michael and Joel would be willing to engage in a little bit of Q&A. I know that one of the most important aspects of this workshop is the opportunity to go deeper on the topics that were raised in the presentations. And I think that I would like to ask a few questions. We haven't had audience questions come in yet because I haven't yet asked for them, but I would just like to offer a few questions that I thought of while I was listening to these two presentations. Is that okay with everyone? Okay, great. One of the first questions I had will be to you, Michael, since you spoke first. It was wonderful to hear about the leadership that Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport has given to the wider airport industry and sector with regard to seeing something and saying something about trafficking. And I'm wondering how we might make a pitch to other airports, whether in Liberia or elsewhere, about how to get on board with the best practices the ATL has identified. How can we get more airports involved, and what are specifically some of those best practices that airports should be thinking about?
Well, thank you, Lily. I believe that participation in all of our industry organizations, whether it be ACI, ACI World, locally, AAE or IOTA, to get those organizations to let other airports know what we're doing, to encourage more participation in the seminars or webinars that each one of them holds, that it be a ongoing topic in many of those areas. Best practices, we've got, two individuals here at the airport who are always out and available to go out and speak and talk about what we're doing, about seeing something, saying something, and training programs. You'll hear from Myrna White, I think, a little bit later, and she'll really kind of detail what some of our efforts have been. But I think always encouraging and keeping this topic at the forefront of any meetings that you might have would be critical.
Thank you. And we are very much looking forward to that presentation by Myrna that will detail some of the things that have taken place at ATL. So thank you very much, because I know that we really want to inspire other airports with this workshop to go to the next level, whatever that next level is for them. Joe, I wanted to ask you this question. You talked a little bit about the factors that have influenced the movement of countries between tier 2 and tier 2 watch list. Obviously, we want to turn the wheels in the other direction. And you talked about the role of partnership in helping us do that. I really appreciated the list of prioritized recommendations that you gave. And I was wondering if you could identify the most important emerging areas for partnership where people on this call might be thinking, how can I be part of that?
Thank you for that excellent question, Levi. And I think what's important to remember is there is a list of recommendations, of prioritized recommendations. In many countries, there have been no prosecutions for an entire year. There have been no prosecutions in some cases for several years. And when a government begins to take prosecutions seriously, and we understand the role of prosecutions and the follow-on conviction and eventually a sentencing per the law of that country, we also then can appreciate what sort of deterrent effect it can have. So the partnership there is really encouraging the government to implement its law fully. The law is stronger. The Liberian law is stronger, and that's why we applaud Liberia for taking that important step. Now what? I've spoken to senior government ministers and the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Minister of Justice, Minister of Labor, Minister of Gender, and on. What now? What resources will the government of Liberia bring to bear? Not U.S. government resources that are going to get credit for the Liberian government. Let's underscore the importance of the TIP report giving credit to governments for their role in these things. So the private sector can certainly help. International donors, the United States and others, can certainly help and guide and encourage. But at the end of the day, what's important? What's the budget line in the national budget devoted to awareness raising, devoted to building up the courts, training up prosecutors, making sure that everybody in law enforcement knows how to identify a trafficking victim or trafficking perpetrator? That's how I think we can best talk about working together. Again, it's not one thing. And the mistake when I was referring to sprinters and marathon runners is it's not a mistake as such. It's just we say focus on as many of these different recommendations as possible, understanding that some probably are weighted more heavily. Our colleagues at the Office of Monitor and Combat Trafficking Persons in Washington will be looking at that. Are there any prosecutions? Have there been any prosecutions in recent years? And are they trending up? Or is there a plateau, or are they trending down compared to not only the previous year, but we you heard my remarks about sort of a moving 5-year period. This is also important. And some of the descriptions of the trafficking situation in Liberia also reflect that five-year period, as we do in every country. So what we hope is that governments and countries will overcome or help make some of those trafficking conditions disappear, and they will fall off the trafficking in persons report. But if something happened 2 years ago and it's still there this year, it may be because there's no evidence of it right now, but we're concerned that it might reemerge if serious steps aren't taken to address it. I hope that helps answer the question.
That does help a lot. And, you know, I'm sure that one thing that many members of our audience could be wondering is whether the COVID pandemic has had any impact on trafficking, the activities of trafficking and traffickers, and also on efforts to combat it. And I'm sure that both Bill and Michael, you have thoughts about that.
Well, I would say that the pandemic did, of course, slow traffic. So there may have been some slowing of some international movement as countries closed and have opened. Domestically, I know the U.S. traffic has been drastically picking up. And of course, we always have major events in the country in which we have unfortunate opportunity for human trafficking or sex trafficking to take place. So that just means that even in spite of a pandemic, that these efforts have to continue, and that there may not be any slack in the awareness, in the training, and in the efforts to stop it.
Lately, I would agree with what Michael just said. The pandemic has been a worldwide pandemic, and governments across the world, the United States, Liberia, have faced serious resource implications from the pandemic. That, I would say, doesn't excuse any of us from letting down our vigilance, letting down our guard. We need to remain vigilant. We need to continue this fight. So I think the pandemic is something that we also don't want to ignore in the area of sexual and gender-based violence. I would simply add that the pandemic has definitely had an impact. We see numbers rising across the world of numbers of persons who are victims of sexual and gender-based violence. One of these cross-cutting issues that we're monitoring as well.
All right, I noticed that we're actually getting a couple of questions from the audience, and here's one. Eddie Jarwolo asks, he says, as a civil society leader working with thousands of young people across Africa, how can I help in creating awareness of the human trafficking issue? He says both presentations were great and eye-opening to increase intervention, but he's looking for tips to help as he works with young people.
Maybe I'll start with that one. First of all, congratulations for the person's commitment and willingness to engage. I think that's already recognition. It already means that someone is aware of the issue and wants to engage. And what I would encourage is, if you're a member of a civil society organization, community-based organization, is do the work that you believe needs to be done. Do your best to engage with the government, because for the purposes of the Trafficking in Persons report, your organization will get credit, but it won't be the credit that the government would like to get in order to raise a country off of a particular tier ranking, or at least stay at the tier ranking where it is, if it's, let's say, in tier 1. But civil society plays an enormous role, and we shouldn't ignore that. And so governments, and I'm speaking to the government of Liberia in this case, should look to its partners in civil society. And if the government doesn't have the wherewithal, maybe it's got a lot of other parties, in addition to fighting trafficking persons, and use those non-governmental organizations, those civil society organizations, give them resources to help them partner with the government in combating this crime.
Right. I know we're getting short on time, but we do have a question from Lena Wright. Lena, you might want to say your question verbally because I haven't seen it in the Q&A box. So you could perhaps come off mute and ask your question. We can answer it in the minute that we have left. Lena, go ahead and if you can take yourself off mute and ask your question. Lena, I think you're still on mute. If you don't mind, try unmuting yourself again. I'm not sure why she's not coming off mute, but I think that I'd like to invite Lena to enter her question to the Q&A box, and maybe we'll get to it later in the session today. So I want to thank both Michael Smith and Joel Maybury for those excellent presentations that have kicked off this workshop on a very high note, offering us valuable information that sets the tone for the rest of the day. And I'd now like to turn it back over to Cynthia to introduce our next presentation.